In this episode, we are moving into a topic that sits at the center of almost every modern system people use, even though most users barely notice it until something goes wrong. Identification and authentication failures are security problems that happen when a system does a poor job of figuring out who is asking for access, proving that identity correctly, or protecting the process after access has started. For a new learner, this matters because almost every important business activity now depends on someone or something being recognized and trusted in the right way. A person signs into email, a contractor reaches a portal, an employee opens payroll records, an administrator changes system settings, and a cloud workload connects to another service, all based on identity and proof. If those steps are weak, attackers do not always need a flashy exploit because they may simply pretend to be someone else, reuse stolen access, or abuse broken trust logic that the organization thought was reliable. That is why this subject matters so much for CySA Plus students. When identification and authentication fail, the result is often unauthorized access, stolen data, fraud, business disruption, and a deep loss of confidence in the systems people depend on every day. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is by separating identification from authentication, because beginners often hear the two words together and assume they mean the same thing. Identification is the claim of who you are, such as entering a username, presenting an account name, offering an email address, or having a service identify itself to another service. Authentication is the process of proving that claim in a way the system accepts, such as supplying a password, presenting a token, confirming a code, or using another approved factor. In simpler terms, identification answers the question of who is trying to connect, while authentication answers the question of whether the system believes that claim. This distinction matters because a system can know which account is being requested without having strong proof that the requester really owns it. A security failure may occur at either stage. The identifier may be too easy to guess, the proof may be too weak, the account recovery path may be poorly protected, or the trust process may continue long after it should have been rechecked. Once you understand that the identity claim and the identity proof are separate steps, it becomes much easier to see where the cracks can form. A simple analogy makes this clearer. Imagine entering an office building and saying you are a certain employee. That is identification because you are naming the person you claim to be. If the guard then checks your badge, matches your face, or confirms a one-time code, that is authentication because the building is asking for proof. The building would have an identification and authentication failure if the guard accepted any name without proof, if old badges still worked after someone left the company, if a visitor could reuse another person's pass, or if the badge system could be bypassed by a weak side entrance. The same logic applies in digital environments. Systems need a reliable way to know who is requesting access and a reliable way to confirm that identity before granting trust. If either part is weak, the whole process becomes fragile. That is important for analysts because many incidents that look complex from a distance are actually identity failures in disguise. The attacker did not always break the whole system. Sometimes they only had to exploit a weak sign-in path, a careless trust decision, or a poorly protected session that let them borrow someone else's identity. Another distinction beginners need is the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication answers whether the system believes you are who you claim to be. Authorization answers what you are allowed to do after the system accepts you. These ideas are connected, but they are not interchangeable, and many organizations confuse them in ways that create risk. A user may authenticate successfully, but still have the wrong level of access if the permissions are too broad. A different user may fail authentication entirely because the proof process is weak, confusing, or easy to abuse. When people say identification and authentication failures, they are focusing on the front door and the trust decision at that door. Still, analysts should remember that a weak front door and weak privilege design often amplify each other. An account with limited rights is not harmless to lose, But an account with broad access becomes far more dangerous if the authentication protecting it is weak. That is why identity topics cannot be treated as isolated login mechanics alone. They shape how the rest of the environment experiences trust, access, and risk from the very beginning of an interaction. Usernames and account identifiers are often treated as simple administrative details, yet they can contribute meaningfully to weakness when they are too predictable, too exposed, or too poorly managed. Some systems reveal valid account names through verbose error messages, public directory details, or easily guessed naming patterns. That does not automatically mean compromise, but it can make targeting easier because attackers no longer need to guess who exists in the environment before they start trying other methods. Shared accounts also create serious problems because they blur accountability and make it harder to know who actually performed an action. If 5 people use one administrative account, then the system may record the account name but still fail to provide real traceability. Dormant accounts add another layer of exposure because they may survive long after the person or process that needed them is gone. A forgotten contractor account, a disabled employee who was never fully removed from a side system, or a test account left in production can all create invisible entry points. Analysts should therefore see account naming, uniqueness, lifecycle control, and visibility as meaningful parts of identity hygiene rather than as routine housekeeping with little security value. Passwords remain one of the most familiar authentication methods, which is exactly why their weaknesses matter so much. A password-based system can fail when users pick guessable secrets, reuse the same password across multiple services, store it carelessly, or fall for phishing that tricks them into surrendering it. The system itself can also fail by allowing weak password choices, storing passwords unsafely, permitting endless login attempts, or creating recovery processes that are easier to abuse than the original sign-in path. This is one reason password failures are so common in real incidents. The problem is not only human carelessness or only technical weakness. The problem is that both user behavior and system design influence whether password authentication is resilient or brittle. A beginner should understand that password risk is rarely just about the string itself. It is about the whole environment around that string, including how it is created, checked, stored, reset, monitored, and protected against guessing or theft. When any one of those areas is weak, the organization may still call the process secure while attackers see it as one of the easiest ways in. Many organizations respond to password weakness with multifactor authentication, MFA, and this is an important improvement, but it is not magic. MFA strengthens authentication by requiring more than one kind of evidence, which makes simple password theft much less useful by itself. Even so, failures can still occur if the chosen factors are easy to intercept, if the workflow allows insecure fallback options, if users are trained to approve prompts without caution, or if account recovery bypasses the stronger protection entirely. There are also cases where MFA is deployed only for some systems, while highly valuable legacy or internal tools remain protected by weaker methods. That inconsistency matters because attackers do not need every door to be weak. They only need one useful door that still trusts insufficient proof. For a security analyst, the lesson is to treat MFA as a strong control that still depends on careful implementation, coverage, user understanding, and recovery discipline. A business may proudly announce that it has MFA, yet still carry serious identification and authentication risk if the actual trust paths around that control remain too loose or too fragmented. Session handling is another part of authentication that beginners often overlook because it takes place after the user signs in. Once a system accepts an identity, it usually creates some way to remember that trusted state so the user does not have to authenticate again on every click. That convenience is necessary for usability, but it also creates new failure points. A session that lasts too long, can be reused too easily, is not invalidated at the right time, or travels through weakly protected channels can become a shortcut for attackers. In that case, the attacker may not need to know the password at all because the system is still treating the session as trusted. This is why authentication is not a one-second event that ends after login. It is a trust relationship that must be maintained and eventually ended correctly. Analysts should pay attention to sign-out behavior, timeout policies, token reuse, device trust settings, and what happens when a user changes credentials or leaves the organization. If the session remains stronger than the user's current legitimacy, then the authentication process is not truly complete. It is still quietly failing in the background. Account recovery and support workflows are often some of the weakest points in the entire identity process because they are designed to help legitimate users who are locked out, stressed, or missing a device. That business need is real, but attackers know it too, and they often target recovery paths precisely because those paths may be less protected than the main authentication flow. A help desk may reset access based on information that is easy to gather from public sources or previous breaches. A recovery email may go to an account the user no longer controls securely. A security question may rely on personal facts that are guessable, discoverable, or socially engineered. When that happens, the organization may invest heavily in strong login protections only to let an attacker walk around them through a softer side door. This is one of the clearest examples of why authentication failures are really trust failures. The system may verify identity carefully at the front end, but then hand out new access through a recovery process that assumes honesty or uses weak evidence. Analysts should therefore examine not just the primary sign-in experience, but the entire identity lifecycle, especially the moments when people lose access and need the organization to restore it. Machines and services also need identities, and this is an area where many beginners focus too much on human users alone. Modern environments are full of application programming connections, service accounts, automation tasks, background jobs, and system-to-system communication. Each of those interactions may rely on credentials, certificates, keys, or tokens that function as identity proof for non-human actors. Identification and authentication failures in this space can be especially dangerous because service accounts often run continuously and may hold broad privileges to keep operations smooth. A poorly managed service secret, a shared automation credential, or a long-lived token stored in an unsafe place can give attackers powerful access without touching any human login page. These weaknesses are often less visible than password problems because users do not complain about them directly, yet the business impact can be enormous. A compromised service identity may expose data, move across internal systems, or operate quietly for long periods because it looks like normal application behavior. Security analysts need to remember that the identity surface of an organization includes both people and machines, and weak trust for either group can become a major incident path. Single sign-on, SSO, and federated identity can improve usability and reduce password sprawl, but they also concentrate trust in ways that deserve careful attention. When SSO works well, users authenticate through a central identity provider and gain access to multiple approved services without maintaining separate passwords everywhere. That can be a big security improvement because it allows stronger control, better visibility, and more consistent policy. At the same time, it means the central identity process becomes even more important because compromise there may ripple outward to many connected systems. A failure in token handling, federation trust, session management, or administrative control at the identity provider can affect far more than one application. For beginners, the key lesson is that centralization changes the scale of both benefit and risk. A well-protected identity platform can improve the whole environment, but a weakly protected one can become a single point of failure for a very large portion of the business. Analysts should therefore examine how much trust is concentrated, what protections surround the identity provider, and whether connected systems verify that trust appropriately rather than accepting it blindly. Human behavior remains deeply connected to this topic because attackers often aim not only at the technology, but at the people using it. Phishing, prompt fatigue, impersonation of support staff, fake login pages, fraudulent reset requests, and social engineering all work by manipulating how people experience authentication rather than defeating encryption in some dramatic way. A user may see a login prompt that looks ordinary and hand over credentials. Another may approve a push notification simply because repeated prompts became annoying during a busy workday. A support representative may genuinely want to help and therefore move too quickly when asked to restore account access for someone claiming urgency. These are not separate from authentication failures. They are part of the same larger trust problem because the system depends on humans making careful choices under real-world pressure. Strong organizations do not blame users and stop there. They design processes that expect stress, distraction, and deception to exist. Analysts should therefore think about identity not only as a technical system, but also as a human interaction pattern where education, workflow design, and protective friction can all influence whether authentication holds up under attack. Detection and response matter because identification and authentication failures do not always announce themselves clearly at the moment they occur. Some clues are obvious, such as repeated failed logins, impossible travel patterns, unexpected MFA prompts, or sudden privilege use from unfamiliar devices or locations. Other cases are quieter and show up only as subtle behavior changes, such as a service account touching systems it normally does not access, a dormant account becoming active again, or a successful sign-in followed by unusual data retrieval. This is why identity monitoring is such an important part of modern defense. Analysts need visibility into login patterns, session behavior, recovery events, administrative changes, and the full life cycle of accounts across human and machine identities. They also need context, because the same event may be normal for one user and alarming for another. A strong detection posture therefore combines technical telemetry with knowledge of business roles, system relationships, and what trusted behavior is supposed to look like. Without that context, identity failures may blend into ordinary activity long enough for attackers to cause major damage before anyone realizes trust has already been broken. For someone studying CySA+, the most practical habit is to think about identity as a chain rather than as a single checkpoint. The chain begins with account creation and naming, continues through authentication methods, recovery processes, session management, service identities, centralized trust, monitoring, and eventual deprovisioning. A weakness anywhere in that chain can undermine the value of stronger controls elsewhere. An organization may deploy MFA and still fail because the help desk resets accounts too easily. Another may have strong user authentication but weak service account handling. A third may centralize identity successfully yet fail to disable old accounts quickly when people change roles or leave the company. Good analysts learn to look for those weak links instead of being satisfied by one impressive control. The question is not whether the organization has an authentication system. The question is whether the full identity trust process is strong, consistent, monitored, and disciplined enough to withstand both ordinary mistakes and deliberate attack. That broader way of thinking is what turns a vocabulary term into a meaningful security skill. By the end of this discussion, identification and authentication failures should feel less like narrow login problems and more like foundational trust failures that can affect every part of a digital environment. A system has to know who is asking for access, prove that claim appropriately, preserve that trust carefully during a session, restore access safely when problems happen, and retire identities cleanly when they are no longer legitimate. When any part of that process is weak, attackers may bypass technical barriers simply by abusing identity, reusing trust, or taking advantage of flawed assumptions about who should be believed. That is why this topic matters so much for new security learners and working analysts alike. Many serious incidents begin not with a spectacular exploit, but with a quiet breakdown in how identity was managed, verified, or monitored. Once you see identity as the operating fabric of trust across users, devices, services, and applications, you can evaluate risk much more clearly and understand why getting authentication right is one of the most important responsibilities in all of cybersecurity.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.